Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning in Washington, D.C., or at least the East Coast of the United States, obviously, afternoon in Israel. It's a great pleasure on behalf of the Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University, the Department of Government, and the Security Studies Program to sponsor this talk by Professor Assaf Moghadam on October 7th, the attacks of October 7th and its repercussions on terrorism studies. There's no one better, in my opinion, to discuss this issue than Professor Moghadam, or Assaf as I'll call him. I've known Assaf since he was a PhD student, so almost a quarter of a century, in fact, pretty close to that. He just recently stepped down as Dean of the Lauder School of Government Diplomacy and Strategy at Reichman University, Herzliya, Israel. Reichman University is the former interdisciplinary center, is one of Israel's elite institutions. I would actually liken it very much to Georgetown and the Lauder School to the School of Foreign Service as an institution that prepares leaders for the future. Assaf is now currently fully back to teaching and to research, and we have the great honor and pleasure of welcoming him next academic year as the Goldman visiting professor from Israel. He will be teaching courses at Georgetown in the spring of 2026. He's the author of several extremely important books, The Nexus of Global Jihad, which was published by Columbia University Press in 2017, The Globalization of Martyrdom, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2008, which in my opinion is still one of the finest books to dissect the phenomena of suicide terrorism. He's editor of the recently published Routledge Handbook of Proxy Wars and co-editor of Fault Lines in Global Jihad. He holds visiting professors at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, amongst other places. Assaf received his PhD and his MALD in International Relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, where he studied under the distinguished Professor Richard Schultz, who's a friend of many of ours, and he obtained his bachelor's in political science from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Assaf, thank you so much for being with us today. We're anxiously waiting your remarks. I had the privilege of reading the paper ahead of time that they're based on. Assaf will talk for about 20, 25 minutes. I'll engage him in a few questions and then open it up to questions and answers from the audience. This will not be a live Q&A. Rather, you need to type in your questions to the webinar chat box, and then I will answer them in order that they're posted. So Assaf, thank you so much for joining us. And let me add to how much we're looking forward to having you on campus in less than a year's time.
Thank you so much, Bruce. It's really such a pleasure and an honor to be here. and I'm really looking forward with great excitement to next year when I can be at Georgetown. And thank you so much. And thank you and to everybody else, Dan Byman, Jonathan Lincoln, and everybody who helped make it happen. As you mentioned, I just finished a stint for 5 years, a 5-year stint as dean at the Lauder School. And I was thinking that because my talk is on October 7th and its impact on the study of terrorism, that maybe just, and I know that everybody, I'm sure everybody who has joined knows how an important event it was, but maybe just to make it a bit more personable, just to start by way of introduction about, how really deeply this event has affected everyone who's living in Israel. So from my personal vantage point as the dean of the Lauder School of Government at Reichman University, I can say, for example, that Reichman University, it's a relatively small campus. We have about 8,800 students, and we had actually 52% of our students who were on reserve duty, so more than half. And that, of course, was very, very disruptive to the students. Some of them served for 200, 300, and even more than 400 days. We've had more than a dozen students who fell in battle, students or alumni or students who have already accepted and were supposed to start this year. About half of them were from the Lauder School of Government. And we also had one student who was actually taken captive on October 7th. Initially, his name is Idan Shtivi. He was supposed to be a second-year student in government and sustainability. We were under the impression that he was alive, and the year after October 7th, it actually turned out that he was killed on October 7th, but his body is still held by Hamas in Gaza, along with almost 60 additional hostages, and I think it's been 522 days today since the October 7th attacks. So this is really just to say how, and again, and certainly I've been one of the people who have been less affected. I think the average Israeli has probably been more affected, but just from my own personal vantage point as a dean, this has had a huge impact. So I wanted to talk a bit about October 7th and its implications for the study of terrorism. And this talk today is based on a paper, as you mentioned, Bruce, that I wrote actually together with one of my former students. He's a West Point cadet who graduated from West Point and then came. His name is Anthony Marco. So I want to give a shout out to him. And then he came to Reichman to do his MA here, and now he's actually a military intelligence officer undergoing training. So anything I say here really it's the work of both of us, and we've been working on this paper, which is supposed to be part of a special issue forthcoming. So in today's talk, I wanted to talk a bit about October 7th and how it impacts terrorism, or more rather the study of terrorism. And I thought I would give you the bottom line up front. And I really want to make 2 points. The first is that, and I develop, of course, this, we developed this in our paper. We have entered, I think, a new era of the study of terrorism, and we call it the maturation period of terrorism studies. So in this period, in this study of ours, we conduct a periodization of the terrorism studies field, and that is one, I think, important takeaway from our paper. And I'll talk briefly about the different periods of terrorism studies. But currently, we argue we're in this maturation period, and the October 7th attacks, we believe, is the signature event of this new era of terrorism studies, this maturation period of terrorism studies. So what I will do in the next kind of 20 minutes or so is I will first take kind of this really, I try to make it very briefly, a brief look at the study of terrorism, kind of just divided into several different periods. I will then talk a bit about why we believe that current era is a new era of maturation of the field. And then I will put the October 7th attacks in the context of this new period of terrorism studies. So in terms of the different eras of terrorism studies, so we want to argue that we believe that there are 5 distinct periods of terrorism studies. And we take a long look, we look back 75 years, actually all the way to the 1950s, which is interesting because terrorism studies as a field, and really nobody knows this better than you, Bruce, really emerged in the 1970s or in the late 1960s, but then in the 1970s when it kind of really started picking up. But we also, we look at what we call the first period is the precursor period. In the 1950s and 1960s, so before the formal kind of beginning of the field, there are very, very few studies that looked at terrorism in isolation. But the ones that kind of did examine terrorism, I think the big takeaway from that period, from the precursor period, was that terrorism was really seen as part of a broader insurgency. So terrorism was usually discussed in the context of broader insurgencies. It was sometimes seen maybe as the initial stage of insurgencies. At other times, terrorism was seen as a tactic that is used by insurgent movements, but one tactic among many, with others being guerrilla warfare, and even conventional warfare could be a tactic used by insurgents. I think one interesting issue about this pre-foundation era, about this precursor period of the 1950s and 1960s, is that at the time, I think most analysts, they did not really ascribe kind of moral judgments on the terrorists or on the terrorist organizations. I mean, the term terrorist organizations was actually not in use at the time. So the motivations of the terrorists, of those who were using terrorism at the time, they were kind of seen even sometimes as honorable because they were seen again as these broader insurgencies. Some of these had very understandable motivations. And so that's the precursor period. And of course, kind of it wound down, the precursor period kind of wound down in the late 1960s, together with the winding down of the Vietnam War and with the rise of international terrorism. So that brings me to the second period of terrorism studies, which is the foundation period. And The foundation period that really kind of started kicking in the late 1960s, I think to us, the foundation period lasted also for about 2 decades, 1970s and 1980s. And in this period, we saw, of course, this was a new era where groups that were driven by a radical national or revolutionary ideology no longer really seemed to be inhibited from perpetrating very, very extreme forms of violence, including attacks that may have been considered beyond the pale in previous eras. And these groups, more importantly, they began kind of engaging in very dramatic, kind of attention-grabbing tactics that increasingly crossed geographic boundaries, attacks against airliners, diplomatic targets, and of course, sports events like the Olympic Games in Munich in 1972. And the signature event, I think, for this particular period, for the foundation period of terrorism studies, the signature event, which was like the harbinger, I think, of terrorism's kind of future destructive potential, was the 1972 attack on the Olympic Games, on the Israeli team, I should say, during the Olympic Games in Munich at the hands of the Black September organization. Maybe I should just add for a second, what do I mean actually by signature events? So what do we mean by signature events? We look at signature events like the Munich attacks or like 9/11, for example, as defining terrorist incidents that best symbolize but also accentuate important developments in the nature of terrorism. They have a lot of significance, major consequence, and therefore they drive important changes in policy, but they also serve as catalysts. These signature events, they also serve as catalysts not just for new policies, but also for important changes in the academic study of terrorism. So in other words, they have policy, but they also have academic implications. And so to go back just to the foundation period of terrorism studies and the Munich attacks in particular kind of showed that terrorism was no longer a sideshow. It was no longer a sideshow in insurgencies, but it took center stage, at least in the perception of people. And the groups that kind of carried out this new form of terrorism, they also kind of took on an identity of their own. The terrorist group basically became an emergent label. The third period of terrorism studies was a period that lasted for only a decade, and this was the pre-9/11 decade, basically the 1990s. So, and the signature event for this third period, which is the contraction, which we call the contraction period of terrorism studies, began with the fall of the Soviet Union at the end of the 1980s. And this was a period, I think, which was marked by a very general decline in terrorist incidents. Of course, there were some major attacks in the 1990s. There was the Oklahoma City bombings, the sarin nerve gas attacks, also in the mid-1990s. But generally speaking, there was a decline, I think, when compared to previous periods in international terrorism, and that also had adverse effects, I think, on the study of terrorism. There was less government funding in the 1990s for terrorism studies. There were fewer conferences. And of course, there was some really, really important research. Bruce, I think your first edition of your book, Inside Terrorism, was published, I think, just at the tail end of the 1990s. So there were some really, really important books. There was a rise. You, for example, were one of the people who started paying attention very early to religious terrorism. There were also debates on weapons of mass destruction in the 1990s, kind of led by the sarin nerve gas attacks. But generally speaking, it was a period when there was kind of like an atrophy of the field in the study of terrorism. And this, of course, changed on 9/11. And so 9/11 is really the fourth period, the fourth major period, or I should say that 9/11 kind of inaugurated the fourth major period of terrorism studies, which we call the expansion period, which lasted for about 2 decades or so. These are not hard dates when these periods change, right? It's kind of they're overlapping with each other. Sometimes there are hard dates, like 9/11 really kind of was a hard date that inaugurated this new period. But so for the next kind of 2 decades after 9/11, there was this virtual avalanche. Of course, 9/11 created this virtual avalanche of terrorism studies. Terrorism became a major policy issue. President George W. Bush, of course, declared a global war on terrorism. The US invaded Afghanistan and later Iraq. And these policy changes, of course, were also then accompanied by many, many changes in the study of terrorism. There was a huge influx of terrorism scholarship. Maybe just to give you all one example, there were, by one count, more books on terrorism that were published in the first 7 years after 9/11 than in the entire history of terrorism before 9/11. And so that's just one of many, many indicators. And I should also say that, of course, we're not the first ones. We didn't invent. Everybody in the field is aware of the impact of 9/11. This is not something that we invented, but it's still important kind of to look at this in a broader context. Methodologically, also, I would say that in the post 9/11 period, I think there were some advances that were made in the field. So there was a lot of criticism regarding the way that research was conducted in the field before 9/11, but after 9/11, even though there was a huge influx, which also brought some people who I think did not really live up to standards of terrorism scholars, but there was also some important advances that were made. There was more data that was generated. There were new research institutions, many of them funded by the government, like START, for example, that started housing data, which scholars could, of course, avail themselves for research. So this expansion period of 9/11, it kind of, I think, it wound down, I think, towards the end of the second decade of the 21st century. Maybe we can kind of think of it when the first Trump administration published the national security strategy, they kind of de-emphasized, I think, the threat of terrorism and highlighted or framed the main threat to the United States in terms of great power competition. And I think for a few years in Washington, there was also kind of like a sense of terrorism being kind of a reduced threat. So this brings me kind of like to the maturation period of terrorism studies, which is, I think, which we would argue is the current period of terrorism studies which we find ourselves in. And so we believe that terrorism studies, by around the end of the second decade of the 21st century, so by around 2020, again, there are no hard dates, right? This is all kind of like seamless progression, I think. But for the last few years, I think we can kind of note that there have been a number of changes in the terrorism studies field, or developments and advances that we believe kind of warrant the term maturation. Of course, some problems remain, but I think that there are a number of indicators that suggest that the field has really, really advanced. And maybe I'll just briefly touch upon a few of them. So first of all, I think the field at this point has produced a number of really, really important theories, concepts, and paradigms that we see, repeated in other studies. We also know that there is, at this point, I think, a critical mass of scholars and also of research outputs. I would also say that there's growing evidence of collaboration in the field, right? So I think much more terrorism research is published, is authored jointly, which is indication usually of a maturation of a field. In previous periods, a lot of the work was conducted by single author, and of course it's always good to have a mix of both. Nobody says that, right? Everybody, but it seems to be evidence of maturation. I think we see greater interdisciplinarity also. So we see people, for example, from computer science, psychology, right, sociology. We see, I think, growing evidence of interdisciplinary research, which is also a positive sign. We certainly, I think, see more rigorous methodologies. We also see a body, I think, of, I would say, canonical literature. We see that terrorism has branched out into a few subfields. Radicalization, for example, jihadism, the critical terrorism studies subfield, right? These are all kind of signs, I think, that the field has matured. So, and of course, again, we develop these a bit more in our study. So one important thing to note is, and this is, I think, an important point, because each of the periods that I mentioned, right, and I think Martha Crenshaw has mentioned this, that terrorism is really, or the study of terrorism is very much driven by by events, right? We're a very, very event-driven field. And so the current maturation period, which I still have to describe, is also driven, I think, by a number of events, and I think we can see the early signs with the rise of ISIS. But every period, I think, has a way of kind of looking and trying to make sense of the threat of terrorism. And I think in every period, there's also a different level of importance that is conferred upon terrorism. So terrorism has different levels of importance in each of the different periods, right? So in the 70s and 80s, it was a super important threat. In the 1990s, it was kind of like, not so important. But I think every period, so looking at it from this perspective, the question is, so in the current period of maturation, how can we make sense of terrorism? How has terrorism evolved? How has the terrorism threat evolved? And how important is terrorism overall as a national security or an international security problem? And here I would just say two things, I think, about the current trends, I think, in terrorism. The first, I think, really has to do with the threat of terrorism. And I think that, if I really needed to kind of put it the most succinct, I would say that the first major trend is that we see that the terrorist threat is a lot more diversified than it has ever been before. It's more diversified in terms of the perpetrators of terrorism, in terms of the location of the attacks, in terms of the motivations for terrorist violence, and also in terms of the opportunities that are provided to terrorists to conduct acts of terrorism. And maybe I will just illustrate this briefly by 2 points. The perpetrators, for example, we see today a much, much broader spectrum of terrorist perpetrators, spanning informal actors, lone actors, informal networks, formal organizations, and even states, of course. But we also see, we see more, of course, terrorism in cyberspace. We also, I think, see greater diversity in terms of ideology. I think nowadays, if we look at the terrorist threat today, I'm not sure that we can argue that there is a dominant ideology, but we see, I think, jihadism and the far right. It's hard to kind of argue which one of them is the more dominant ideology. They're both, I think, super important threats. And we also see, of course, growing, for example, cross-pollination and convergence of terrorism threats. There are different ways that people have called it: salad bar ideologies, fringe fluidity, fused extremism. But the idea is today that ideologies are increasingly converging, fusing with one another, and that creates a threat. One of my colleagues at West Point, Don Rassler, has called this the compound nature of terrorism, which I kind of liked. So that's the one trend, I think, when we think about the contemporary threat of terrorism, which also drove new research. The second main trend is, I think, that that the context for terrorism is becoming increasingly broad. And in other words, that terrorism, there's much, much greater connectivity, I would say, between terrorism and other forms of violence, but even beyond violence, other forms of political agitation. And what I mean here is that, so in terms of other forms, I think that terrorism today nests much more so, not just within broader insurgency, which was true of the precursor period, but it nests within even conventional war. I think that, for example, the distinction between terrorism today is a component within proxy wars, for example, right? I think that the boundaries have become much more diffuse between what is terrorism and what are other forms of armed conflict. And so that's one point. And I would also say that terrorism, as I mentioned, is becoming increasingly connected, or there's a growing interconnectivity with other forms of extremism and political agitation. For example, conspiracy theories, hate speech, specific forms of bigotry, such as anti-Semitism, and in their especially in their various online manifestations. So the point is that terrorism, I think, has really become this very, very diverse, adaptive threat, but also a threat that is nested within a much, much broader problem set, right? Armed conflict, proxy wars, insurgencies, civil wars, but also other forms of political agitation. And so that, I think, is something worth paying attention. And I think that a lot of the studies in this current period of terrorism are kind of taking account of this. Maybe just one way to illustrate this, I think as contemporary terrorism is increasingly interactive with other forms of violence and other forms of extremism and with different forms of political agitation, I think the resulting threat of terrorism, it occupies a much, much broader spectrum also. So on the one hand, for example, we can see that the threat of terrorism in certain ways is becoming more mainstream, right? And there are some actors that are trying to kind of divest some of the violent attributes of terrorism from it, make it a lot more not respectable, but to normalize it. But on the other hand, and this is something which I think, Bruce, you have written about recently in War on the Rocks, we can see on the other end of the spectrum forms of ultra-violence, right? So the spectrum of the terrorist threat is really, really broad. Ultra-violence, as we've seen with ISIS, but also on October 7th on the one hand, all the way to attempts to mainstream terrorism, which we can see maybe examples in Al-Muhajirun, for example, in the UK, right, and so forth. So, I promise I'll be done in a few minutes. So I'm coming to my conclusion. And what does all of this really? Well, maybe just a few words about October 7th, because I haven't spoken about it. So why is October 7th? I think why is October 7th really kind of like, in my opinion and in my co-author's opinion, why is it a signature event of the current period of terrorism studies? What makes October 7 kind of this monumental event, right, that kind of signifies this new era of terrorism studies? So first of all, I think the October 7th attacks, they illustrate this really, really close link between terrorism and other forms of political violence. If you think about the nature of the attack, right? The attack was a terrorist attack, but it was also a guerrilla attack, right? There was an armed attack on IDF bases, right? There were hundreds of soldiers that were killed on October 7th, in addition to hundreds of civilians. So that's one issue. A second aspect that makes the October 7th attacks, I think, the signature event, apart from, of course, its monumental impact and the huge death toll, which I think, and I haven't mentioned this, but maybe just as a side note, when we think about the impact of October 7th, and if we use 9/11 numbers of population figures from the US during 9/11, it's mind-blowing, right? It's like more than 30,000, imagine more than 30,000 people who were killed on 9/11. I think 7,000 people who were kidnapped. Imagine that about 25% of those 7,000 people that were kidnapped are still held in captivity, right? We're now a year and a half or so after October 7th. I mean, I think the numbers are really, really mind-blowing. A second aspect of the October 7th attacks that I think fits in nicely with this idea of terrorism, its diverse threat, is the complex nature of the attacker, right? Hamas, it's not simply just a group that conducts terrorism, but it's also the ruler in Gaza. It's an insurgency, it's a broader social movement, it's an army, it's a criminal organization. It is a lot of everything. It's an example of this multi-layered nature, I think, of contemporary terrorist actors. The October 7th attacks, I think, they also illustrate collaboration between organizations, right? Which is something I mentioned before, because it was not only Hamas that attacked Israel on October 7th, right? There were other lesser factions. There were factions of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, of the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and there were also civilians, right? It's important to keep in mind, we're not just talking about militant organizations, but we're actually also talking about civilians, right, who took advantage of the barrier, right, being torn apart. And I think this also is something which is a sign of the times. Not to speak, of course, about Hezbollah joining in, right, a day later on October 8th, when it started sending rockets. Iran and its unprecedented ballistic missile attack on Israel, which turned this into something much, much broader, not just an engagement with a single organization. The fourth point that I would make is that October 7th, I think, serves to illustrate contemporary terrorism in its very, very deep investment in the information domain. right? I think that Hamas has employed modern technology. It's not the first one, of course, who did so. I think ISIS kind of has led the way here. But Hamas maybe has perfected it, right? Used GoPro cameras, live streamed its attacks on Israeli communities and army bases. And also, right, the way that when it eventually released some of the hostages, it made spectacles, right? It created these spectacles to humiliate the Israelis and attempting to show Gazans that it continued to govern the Strip. So that's another point. I would also say that I think October 7th exemplifies this new worrying trend of ultraviolence that you spoke about, Bruce, in your recent article in War on the Rocks, which is a great article, which I highly recommend. And I think that, we probably don't need to say anything else about this. I think everybody's aware of the ultra-violent nature of the October 7th attacks. And then finally, I would just say that October 7th has also almost immediately generated this global campaign designed to rally international support, a global wave of anti-Semitism, campus protesters. And this, I think, exemplifies what I mentioned earlier about this connection between terrorism and broader political agitation, which I think this particular attack exemplifies in ways that others don't. So let me just conclude by saying that the signature event, that October 7th, as I mentioned, is the signature event, we believe, of the maturation period of terrorism studies. And I think as such, it kind of really symbolizes and accentuates some of the most important features, I think, of contemporary terrorism. So it is really similar in that sense, I think, to Munich 1972, to the 9/11 attacks, and to similar signature events. And I think that if other signature events are any guide, then I think that the October 7th attacks are likely to continue to have an influence on this form of terrorism that we see today. It will probably serve as an intellectual backdrop for many people who are going to write about terrorism in the next, in the foreseeable future. And of course, it serves as a very, very painful reminder of what terrorism is capable of doing. So I'll stop here.
Great. Thank you so much, Assaf. Let me make one important correction. And in my article, actually, we credit someone who's on this webinar. It was Jessica Stern and J.M. Berger in their brilliant book on ISIS that coined the term ultraviolence. And in it's an article you refer to War on the Rocks. We cite Jessica and J.M. and say they argued this was a phenomena that they had detected with ISIS. And our argument is that they were entirely correct. And we see this tragically, as you've pointed out, played out in the October 7th attacks, where terrorism has crossed a new threshold of barbarity, as we all know. But my question to you is: I agree entirely with your assessment about the importance and significance and lasting effects of October 7th. In fact, I might even go further and say that it's on par with the 1972 Munich Olympics, and will have even greater repercussions than 9/11. And we already see this. I mean, what's happening in Syria today is a direct product of October 7th. So the repercussions have been very profound. But I would almost say, and again, you're a gray beard, I'm now a white beard, so white beard even more cynical and disputatious. But you very charitably and perhaps accurately describe the current phase of terrorism studies as its maturation phase. What worries me as, this geriatric student of terrorism is that it's actually the infantilization of terrorism studies, in the sense that in your really, I think, very perceptive unpacking of the various periods of terrorism studies, I almost worry we're in a back to the future mode. And what you described as that initial insurgency period, that was also when terrorism as a term began to be watered down. And we got into this debate of freedom fighters versus terrorism. And it was in the 1950s as people were rising up, principally in Algeria, the FLN, but also AOCA in Cyprus, and the revolutions that were happening against the older European colonial powers. Many people said, well, they can't be terrorists because they're fighting for their freedom. And terrorism became accepted. Where I see a huge difference is that continued into the 60s. There was a romanticism attached to terrorism, certainly, even through the 70s. In the 80s, largely because of Hezbollah's depredations, the massive, suicide car and truck bombings. There was widespread agreement that terrorism was something that was bad. And this actually pulls together, we may dig deeper, but I'm looking at the questions. This actually pulls together a lot of the questions that we're getting as well. I mean, don't you think that in two respects, terrorism is becoming, ironically, much more accepted and tolerated than
Mhm.
it's in past decades? In the sense that we see all sorts of infographics that, people are entitled to resist when they're oppressed however they want. And this is done to excuse the mass rapes, for example, and then the carnage perpetrated on, the hideous tortures and so on. But even in the academy, we find, especially with the rise of critical terrorism studies, is that groups that there was once broad agreement. I mean, we didn't have students demonstrating in the United States and Canada and Australia and Western Europe praising Al Qaeda. Although just recently on TikTok, again, another repercussion of October 7th is all of a sudden bin Laden's letter from 2004 became celebrated by students. But we have a phenomenon now. No one was wearing Al Qaeda headbands or waving Al
Mhm.
Qaeda flags, but this has become absolutely commonplace, not least in the United States and on many of our campuses. Georgetown has been vandalized with the spray painted the Hamas targeting triangle, which is deeply offensive on any level, but especially to Jewish students, staff, and faculty at this university. But all that seems to be more accepted and tolerated. And even in the realm, let's say, of critical terrorism studies,
Mhm.
problem is not seen to be the terrorists, but responses such as Israel's response in Gaza, U.S. interventions, and so on. So, are we not going back to a previous
Mhm.
era where terrorism was more tolerated and accepted, not just publicly, but even on campuses and in classrooms?
I think Bruce, this is a fantastic point. A couple of thoughts that I would make. First of all, I agree with you. I agree with you, and I think that when we think about maturation, I'm not. I think when I thought of the term maturation, I didn't mean necessarily maturation as, now terrorism is in this fantastic stage. We now have reached the end of history for terrorism studies, and now everything is, now we've reached the absolute pinnacle. I think that maturation. I think the idea of maturation also is really that the terrorism is becoming embedded in a much broader array, and I think that by definition, once terrorism becomes embedded much more within, not just within broader forms of armed conflict, but also within politics more broadly, right? I mentioned earlier that there's, I think, this much broader spectrum in which we can see terrorism right now. Right, from on the one hand, you have these attempts of mainstreaming terrorism, and I think what you allude to, right, with some of the reactions of October 7th, I think that was actually a very good example of attempts to whitewash, right, or to argue that maybe it wasn't really terrorism, or maybe Israel had it coming. I think it's actually part of this trend that we're seeing today, that there is, I think, yeah, there's this much broader spectrum. So I don't think that we necessarily have more consensus among scholars today about what terrorism is or should be. I think in the maturation period, we have actually a much greater diversity, and that's not necessarily a good thing, right? We have much greater diversity, I think, about. Terrorism, in a way, has, I think, entered also the political game. And terrorism, of course, has always been political by nature, but I think nowadays, as it has, as it really as terrorism occupies this broader spectrum, I think it makes it also easier for people to politicize it, even more so than previously. But again, I wanted to just maybe focus on this one point, that I don't necessarily think that finding a consensus is necessarily a best sign of maturation. When it comes to terrorism, for example, I think one of the critiques that people have leveled traditionally on terrorism scholars is that there is no universally accepted definition of terrorism. And that's true, that there isn't any one universally. But I also think that, I think that this was cited previously oftentimes as a lack of maturation or lack of development in the field. But if you would ask me, Bruce, I think that actually such diversity is not necessarily a sign of lack of maturation. I think that it's okay for scholars to debate definitions. I think it's okay to have multidisciplinary methodological approaches. I think that field can be strong and mature through diversity. But again, of course, but here, I mean, the aspects of diversity that you mentioned are really, really problematic, right? Because I think they challenge, I think, the fundamental understanding of what terrorism should be, which is, first of all, a form of political violence, that really infringes on people's lives and security. It's a very long-winded question to what is a really, really great point. I don't think that we will see consensus about terrorism, and I think that what you're saying about the growing challenges of what used to be a fundamental understanding that terrorism is something bad, and that we can identify terrorism as something and say this is bad and this is vile and we should not support it and we should fight it. I think that a bad side effect of the maturation period is probably we will see more such challenges, as we also see them from the critical terrorism studies field, on what terrorism is and how we should maybe address it.
Right. Let me go to some of the questions that are pouring in, and I'm going to try to get to all of them. I'm going to reinterpret the first question only because we can't ask. It's a question about a graduate student at Georgetown who has close family and indeed personal connections with Hamas. It's unfair to ask you that question because you're not actually teaching at Georgetown now, so you can comment on it. I would say to the questioner, you should feel free to write to either myself or the director of the Center for Jewish Civilization, Jonathan Lincoln. We're better positioned perhaps to at least try to answer your question. But let me rephrase that question. As an Israeli scholar, of, as we agree, and as you've just described, a very contentious field, how do you anticipate coming to the United States? Do you have any concerns or worries as a terrorism scholar from an Israeli university, Israeli citizen coming to teach in the United States on this subject?
So, I may have a few concerns, but I'm not going to let that dictate my decisions. And actually, a big part of first of all, I've always been a huge fan of Georgetown. I used to live in the nation's capital in Washington for a few years, and I used to come to Georgetown quite a lot. And so for me, it's first of all a huge honor to be affiliated with Georgetown next year. I'm not worried though. Not that I don't think that there is reason to be worried. I think that there are situations on campuses, I think, that we've witnessed in the US that really, really are dangerous, right? But I'm not concerned for myself. And I think that we must not be concerned. I think that we must not show that we're afraid. I think that also, we have to stick to our truths and we have to stick to our values. And I think that, I believe in academic freedom. I believe in everything that universities stand for, and I will be there teaching what I think should be taught, which is, and I will encourage debate in my classes. But I think that we have to stand up and we have to stand our ground, and I think that we must not leave. We have to stand up to the bullies, and part of the reason why I'm looking forward to being at Georgetown next year, I think, is I want to actually witness things firsthand. I want to see what's going on the ground, but I also want to support. I want to support not just Jewish students, but I want to support every student, and their right to express their opinion, but to do so in a way that doesn't infringe on other people's rights, and in a way that upholds universities' missions. And I think that the university's mission has to be to educate people, right? And so we have to stand up to this mission of universities, to educate for the free flow of ideas, but also to respect other people and to respect every person's ability to study also in these universities. And I will contribute to that as much as I can.
Well, also to the fact that you're teaching not just in the Center for Jewish Civilization, but at the Department of Government and in the Security Studies program, I think underscores how invaluable your presence here will be and how much we're looking forward to it. Let me pose a question that's tied to that as well. Could we view academic boycotts, including a hard anti-normalization that's expressed by various people, um, regarding Israel diplomatically as on the spectrum of terrorism. It's
No,
not just kinetics; it's the non-kinetics.
yeah, I think that, I would certainly not call it terrorism. To me, terrorism has to be, to me, terrorism has to have a component of violence. I know that in some definitions of terrorism, the threat of violence is also is sufficient, but I've always been a bit torn about that. And to me, I think the element of violence also has to be there. So no, I wouldn't consider it an act of terrorism. I think it's a really really bad idea. I think that if anybody is truly interested in bringing people together, in establishing peace, in actually helping the Palestinian people, then an academic boycott would be the last thing that I would support. And it just shows, I think, the true face of those who are wishing for, I think those who wish to boycott academics in Israel, right? I mean, they're not helping the Palestinian cause at all. Academics in Israel, by the way, are some of the most left-leaning people anyway. So you're also targeting the wrong group, but that's beside the point.
Right, now lots of questions are coming in, so let me very quickly start turning.
Mhm.
Can you parse terrorism that targets civilians consistently versus terrorism freedom fighting that targets the military? Just gets into one of the core definitional issues that, of course, our old friend and
Yeah.
colleague Boaz Ganor has written extensively about.
Mhm.
He's now the president of Reichman University.
So I don't think that it's a juxtaposition, I think, of terrorism and freedom fighter. I think that when it comes to targeting civilians versus military personnel, I think the better bifurcation or juxtaposition would be terrorism and guerrilla. So generally speaking, attacks against military targets are guerrilla attacks, and attacks against civilian targets are terrorist attacks. Of course, sometimes it's very, very difficult because, some attacks, including the October 7th attacks, right? They were targets against civilians and against military personnel. So what do you call it, right? It just shows kind of the much more complex nature. The idea of, one man's terrorism is another man's freedom fighter. I mean, that's, I think, something that is, I think, a distinction, or that is a statement which I think points at the inherently politicized nature of terrorism, right? I think that all of us who study terrorism, we have our inherent biases, right? And I still sometimes, when I teach in Israel and I talk about the Stern Gang or Lehi in the context of terrorism, I still get every now and then, some raised eyebrows. But then I think we have to call terrorism for what it is. To me, terrorism is a form of political violence that is primarily targeting civilians, that is aimed to sow fear, that is aimed to influence a larger audience. It is also a psychological warfare in a sense, and it has political aims, right? And so it's not to me this idea of one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. To me, terrorism is terrorism. Yeah.
Uh, what elements of Soviet anti-Semitic tactics do you see in the post-October 7th protest movements? And how should this shape our strategies
Mhm.
against both terrorism and anti-Semitism?
So first of all, I think that a lot of the anti-Semitism and a lot of the pro-Palestinian support, of course not all. I mean, there's the vast majority of pro-Palestinian institutions and organizations are legitimate, whether we like it or not. But these are legitimate. But I think that, and we know this actually, that the Soviets have already back in the late 60s, already 1970s, they have been funding some of the most radical pro-Palestine student groups, not just in the United States, but especially in Europe. I know this, I wrote about this before. There were various Palestine solidarity committees, for example, that were active in Germany, especially after the Yom Kippur War of 1973, where we saw a major rise in anti-Israeli activity on European campuses. And much of it has actually been supported by the Soviet Union, which for the Soviets back then, just as it is today, I think it was a way to weaken Western solidarity, right? And so I think that I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the campus activities that we see today, I think that it is not just a spontaneous uprising, right? I think that some of it might be spontaneous, I'm sure. But I think that there are actually institutions that are funding this, and I'm, from my sense, the Russians have certainly a hand in it.
What do you think of the warnings of female Israeli border observers? Why do you think they were dismissed prior to October 7th, despite their critical role in intelligence? And how might this reflect a broader blind spot in the field of terrorism studies?
Yeah. So I'm not sure how to connect it to terrorism studies, but I can say, and I think that, when we look at the blunder of October 7th, I think that the failures were systematic and they were at all levels. They were from the level of these spotters, right, all the way to the strategic level, to a level of how to conceive the threat and, viewing Hamas as the lesser threat versus Hezbollah. I think that the issue with the spotters is a particularly painful episode, I think, and a particularly difficult and problematic aspect of the failure. And I think a lot of it also has to do with a culture, right? A culture of, I would even say, chauvinism. And I'm not afraid to say it. I also say it here, and this is something which I think is also understood. I think that I think that there has been a problem actually in terms of moving such warnings up the chain of the command. I think that initial investigations into the October 7th blunder have already shown that things that should have reached the higher echelons of the chain of command, the military as well as the political chain of command, they did not reach them because the spotters, who had very, very credible and legitimate concerns, right, and they gave warnings not just once and not just twice, they were even dismissed by lower level intelligence officers. So part of it is a culture, I think, of even of chauvinism. Part of it is, I think, just once the routine starts kicking in, right? Once you have kind of and I think that if we talk about what is the greatest, perhaps, blunder and reason why we've suffered the October 7th attacks, I think it lies in what the Israelis call the conception. This idea that Hamas was deterred, that it really doesn't want to harm us, that that they want peace. And I think that, this was, once you have convinced yourself, and I think that a lot of, this has been an across the board almost conviction of people on the military and political levels. Once you've convinced yourself of that, then you will dismiss any evidence to the contrary. And I think this is what happened.
Do you think we're at risk of doing the same thing now with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and al-Jolani or al-Shara in Syria?
I think there's certainly an element of wishful thinking, but I think that anybody who has been watching and certainly who has been examining jihadism for a long time, I mean, I think that it makes so much more sense to be wary and to be suspicious about Jolani in general, but also about jihadists. I haven't really seen, I think, too much evidence about jihadis who have all of a sudden become Jeffersonian Democrats, and I think we've seen some really worrying signs in recent weeks that maybe some of this enthusiasm about Jolani that we saw on some parts of Washington, think tankers maybe was not really warranted. But I think Bruce, maybe also to your question, I think that this idea of I think there's nothing specific to Israel necessarily. I think that there are. I think that much of the blunder actually echoes what happened to the U.S. on 9/11, right? A culture of not paying attention, a failure of imagination, as I think you also once put it. I think that at some point in time, no nation can really remain vigilant 24 hours a day. And once routine starts to kick in, right, that's, I think, because terrorists, they have so much patience, right? And they just wait for this routine to kick in. And necessarily at some point, routine is going to kick in. It may take 10, 20, 30, or 50 years, but then there can be a strike.
We could also draw a parallel with 9/11 and the female spotters on the border, because of course the Bin Laden station or Alex station as it was called, that was stood up by the CIA in 1996 to focus specifically on Osama bin Laden, was largely staffed by women. And their persistent warnings about the threat of Al-Qaeda were also ignored. So the question from our colleague Samantha Cutner was a
Absolutely.
good one, because there is a parallel. Don't forget, they were derided and derisively referred to as the Manson family. That's in
Yeah,
how
remember that.
high esteem their analysis and their warnings were taken. Well, we're bang on at 10 o'clock, which means we have to adjourn. Thank you so much, Assaf, for making
Thank
time
you.
on a busy day to speak to us. We're tremendously enthusiastic about welcoming you to campus next January. It'll be great to have you with us for the entire semester. So thank you for this taste of what our students can expect next year. And thank you to everyone for attending this this webinar. Believe tomorrow morning we'll hear from Professor Chuck Freelich, who will also be he'll be the Andrew Siegel visiting professor at Georgetown next year. So thank you again, Assaf. And
Thank you so much, Bruce. Thank you for having me.
absolutely.
Bye bye.